Hey, what's up?
Scribe is how 4 million people turn processes into step-by-step guides. The hardest part of any job, I don't care where you work, is answering the same questions over and over. You're gonna want to see this. That's why there's Scribe. Go to scribehow.com, click the
Hello?
capture, do the task once. Scribe
hello?
will create a step-by-step guide you can share automatically. Warning, they're gonna think you're a genius and ask you how you did it. Just say Scribe. Scribe instantly turns any workflow into a step-by-step guide.
There is no God.
Can I?
No, be quiet. There is not one jot of evidence for God.
But not every atheist shares your view on abortion.
I don't care what they think. I know what I think. The resurrection of Jesus never happened. I mean,
Well, that's an assertion, Peter. What about some evidence?
Can you understand, Peter, how saying that might come across as incredibly arrogant?
no.
No.
Peter, it's dead easy to say it's not worth listening to. You tempt me to say that about some of the things you say, but I'm not going to do that. Because it seems to me it's very important to listen to what Christianity claims before you judge it.
Oh, Jesus.
Well, you've got it, Peter. It was.
Science deals with real questions. Science deals with questions for which there is evidence, whereas a typical religious question might be, what is the purpose of the universe? Science can dismiss that as an irrelevant question. There is no evidence that there is any purpose in the universe. One major question is, why is there something rather than nothing? It certainly seems as though there is something, and we presume that before there was something, there was nothing. So it seems to be a real question, and science has as its objective an attempt to answer that kind of question. And there is no reason other than pessimism to expect that science will grind to a halt and not answer all the real great questions of existence.
Thank you very much. So, an emphatic yes to the idea that, in principle, science can explain everything that's worth explaining in that sense. So, John, same question to you. Can science explain everything?
You're going to be surprised at how much I agree with Peter, because the definition of science he offered us, that is collecting evidence, making observations, if that's what we mean by science, and it's the old meaning of science before the 19th century, then of course science can explain everything, because the very word explanation means making evidence-based observations and notes. So my short answer is, if we accept Peter's first definition, then I agree with him entirely. Science, by definition, explains everything. And when people these days say science can explain everything, they're not referring simply to making observations and comparing notes at all. For instance, that would apply to any historical or forensic examination. And my faith as a Christian is based precisely on the kind of scientific reasoning that Peter has set forward to us. Let me just say, by the way, that from the Christian perspective, Luke, the writer of the third gospel, tells us that that is exactly what his method was. He consulted people, he made observations, and then he put them together. So we'll call that science one. What is, of course, at stake today is the question, can the natural sciences answer every question? And there I think that that is simply not the case. the Nobel Prize winner Peter Medawar. He said, we do science a disservice, natural science, if we think it can address any questions. And he referred to the basic questions of Karl Popper, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? Natural science doesn't answer questions like that. And Medawar added it is to religion, philosophy, and so on that we must go to answer those questions.
Whew,
I
that was
think
close.
science is immensely powerful. It is immensely exciting, and it uncovers a vast amount about our universe. But I have a problem by going too far. I'm a
Almost
mathematician,
lost right
and
now.
I'm rather interested in logic. And you know, if we say that science can explain everything, or science is the only way to truth, as it's often put, well, that is not a statement of science. It's a statement of belief. And so if it's true, it's false. Maybe it's too early in the evening for logic like that, but there's a huge logical problem. To sum up my position, science is powerful. Its methodologies are extremely important also in the sphere of history, forensic science, and in the sphere of religion. But I'm going to be careful here, because Peter is right very often in his critique of superstition, of mythology, and nonsense. And science has helped to clear away some of the nonsensical things that sometimes religious people profess. But what really makes me, in one sense, very much in favor of the Christian faith is that from the very start it claims to be evidence-based. And the central piece of evidence is, of course, as you probably know, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I believe in Peter's methodology. I use it all the time, but somehow he feels that a Christian like me doesn't use that methodology within my own Christian faith. Final point, I think explanation. Can science explain everything? We need to tease out what we mean by the word explanation. For example,
Got
the
'em.
law of gravity doesn't explain gravity. It tells us wonderful mathematics that we can calculate the way in which heavy bodies move in relationship to one another. But even when we say science explains, often it doesn't explain comprehensively. And I just want to throw a very simple analogy into this, which I find quite useful. About boiling water. How would you explain boiling water? Well, you can explain it by talking about heat conduction and agitation of molecules of water. You can also say the water is boiling because I'd like a cup of tea. Now, those two explanations are very different. They don't conflict. They complement. One is a scientific explanation, natural scientific, but the other is an explanation in terms of the intention and purposes of an agent. And Peter said quite clearly, science doesn't go in for that kind of purpose. But that doesn't mean that kind of purpose doesn't exist. In fact, people have been enjoying tea for millennia before they knew anything about the theory of heat in physics. So what I want to say is this. The God explanation is different from the science explanation. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with physics as an explanation of the motor car.
Okay, thank you. Great introductory statements from both of you.
Well, there's so much nonsense to hack away from.
This may be the phrase of the evening. Yes.
Yeah. Let's go to what you called the core of your approach, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Never happened. I mean,
Well, that's an assertion, Peter. What about some evidence?
well, what about some evidence that it did happen, other than people who are writing Gospels of 80 years later than the event that they purport to be talking about? No, of course it didn't happen. How could it happen? And science, I think, could even go so far as saying it simply could not happen. When you've got a dead body, it's decaying straight away. There's no way that it's going to reconstitute in some way. It's absurd. And I accept that it is the foundation of Christian faith. That doesn't mean to say that it's true. And so let's dismiss that as something that simply has no evidence whatsoever of any credible
Before we
nature.
dismiss it, let's hear a response from John, because obviously this is an important issue. What counts as evidence and what are the assumptions
and indeed,
we make?
I suppose you would argue that science cannot explain the resurrection.
Well,
I wouldn't quite argue that way. I would say that science cannot forbid a resurrection. Because you see, science proceeds on discovering the regularities to which nature works and has done a very impressive job. And the fact that we know that dead bodies don't normally rise, that is a law of nature in that sense, means that we recognize something very special happened, if it did happen. But the point is this. C.S. Lewis long ago told a little analogy. If I stay in a hotel tonight, put £100 in a drawer, and do the same tomorrow night, there are £200 in it. 1 + 1 = 2. If on the third morning I find 50 quid, what do I say? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? Clearly, I say the laws of England have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's our recognizing of what normally happens that helps us to see an exception. Now, if I were claiming that the body of Jesus rose from the dead by processes, natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before we happened, yes, that would be wrong. But I'm not claiming that. What Christians claim is that the God that created the universe and built the regularities into it is capable...
Pure speculation.
Wait a minute. No, this is
not worth listening
This isn't speculation. Well,
let's listen and then you respond, Peter.
Peter, it's dead easy to say it's not worth listening to. You tempt me to say that about some of the things you say, but I'm not going to do that. Because it seems to me it's very important to listen to what Christianity claims before you judge it. And what is claimed is the God who creates the universe and sustains it is not subject to laws as if they were laws of a land. He set up the regularities and he can feed a new event into them. And the claim is, and with this I finish, that God raised Christ from the dead by an input of colossal power.
Oh, Jesus.
Well,
Monday.com, the opposite of any work platform we tried in the past. We tried other work management platforms, not naming names. They all suck. Monday, total opposite. It didn't just work, it spread. And people became Monday evangelists. And you know why? Because people actually liked using it. No, it's not a chore. It's intuitive. You don't have to force anyone. They're on board. You can really see that Monday care about their user. The user is king. You can create workflows yourselves, no IT, no admins. And that's why we love it. There's no roadblocks. Everything can just be done instantly. We have people creating workflows and showing them off around the company. They take pride in it. I know it sounds like a commercial, but honestly, I never expected it to have this much influence.
you've got it, Peter, in one.
Look, I mean, this
Well,
is...
that is the claim at the end of the day.
But, I mean, this is... everyone knows here that's nonsense. What you're inventing is an agent who can do anything he likes. He or she likes, I suppose you have to say these days. And so it is the laziest way of accounting for observations.
But the point is, as I sit here and read your books and explaining chemistry and all this kind of thing, I say this is wonderful. This is not contradicting the God explanation, because the God explanation is saying that you, as a chemist, only have a universe to study because God created it in the first place. But he's not competing. In fact, interestingly, the very early chapters of Genesis, God commands human beings to name the animals. He starts off taxonomy, which is the basic intellectual discipline. In other words, he said, you go and do science, and you'll find it utterly fascinating. So I think you're arguing at a straw God and not a straw man.
You don't know whether God was starting off science. He might have got so bored with his creation that he wanted to amuse them.
So who's speculating now?
Yeah, I am.
Yes. Okay.
I think any speculation that uses the word God is intellectually corrupt.
I mean,
But this is absurd.
There is no God.
Can I-
No, be quiet. There is not one jot of evidence for God.
The fact that at the heart of biology is the longest word we've ever discovered, the genetic code, is again consistent that this universe is a word-based universe. In the beginning was the Word. All things were made by him. So I see evidence of rational intelligence all over science, but I see that the alternative worldview, atheism, undermines that, although it perceives the very same rational intelligence. And so as explanatory power at that level, but you see, I did say Christianity is not merely a philosophy. And if Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, then that opens up huge possibilities of personal encounter in my life now. And the major reason why I believe that Christianity is true is because Christianity is testable.
Oh, nonsense. How can it be tested?
Well, Peter, let me face that head on. Christ said when he was on earth.
But go ahead.
Christ said that if a person considered the evidence and came to believe that he was God incarnate, who was dying on a cross to give forgiveness and bring peace with God, well, we can test that. I've tested it, and I've seen hundreds of people test it. I mean, take an example. I was lecturing at Harvard a while ago to a couple of thousand people, and when I'd finished, a young Chinese student stood up and he said, "Look at me." So we looked at him, and I said, "Why should we look at you?" He was absolutely beaming. He said, "You should look at me because 6 months ago I came to a lecture you gave at Penn State University. I was at the end. My life was in a complete mess, and something you said triggered a search. And I started to read the New Testament for myself, and I became a Christian. And just look at me now." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that happen not once, not twice, dozens of times. And when you see addiction to drugs transformed into food on the table, when you see broken relationships mended, and you ask people, what happened to you? And they say variously, I became a Christian, I had an encounter with Christ. You begin to put 2 and 2 together and make 4. And I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that these promises that Jesus made actually can be fulfilled in a person's life today. And that's immensely important to me, the testability of Christian relationship with
Well,
God.
it's a kind of testability that you should leave to the psychologists and the psychiatrists, I think.
But I don't mind the psychiatrists. What do you mean, leave it to them?
Well,
The
because
psychologists-
they will understand why these people have found the comfort. Let's accept that it may be comfort.
But that doesn't prove it's wrong, Peter, to use your argument. The fact that Christianity brings comfort is not evidence against it. It may well be evidence for it. If it brought discomfort and ruined
Oh, it's
people's
brought a
lives,
great deal of discomfort. Ask Joan of Arc, for example.
you're raising another question, and I'm Irish. I'm very sensitive to that question, and I could go into it if you want to.
I don't need an agent behind it unless that agent is infinitely indolent, is infinitely anarchic, or is infinitely ignorant, which I don't think you would ascribe qualities, those qualities to your God. So I don't need a God to account for this world.
We obviously don't have time to go into the fullness of what you wrote in that book, but the phrase that really struck me from the book was you said on a few occasions, nothing rolled over into something. That was the way in which the universe, which is clearly something, came from nothing. Now, this was referenced by you earlier, John.
Well, it sounds like nonsense to me. And you know, Peter, what do you mean by nothing in that context?
I mean the absence of space-time.
Or do you mean what most of us mean, the absence of anything?
That's what I mean what I said.
Okay, right. Well, I'm very interested in nothing. In fact, I give lectures on nothing these days.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to enter a discussion like this, and I was surrounded by the experts, probably the world's most famous cosmologist, and I did something I never usually do. I said I'd like to ask the first question. So I said, Alan, look, there's much to do about nothing. And I want to ask you a question. When you, as a cosmologist, use the word nothing, do you mean what all the rest of us mean as absence of anything. He said, no, we do not.
Well, he was wrong. He should. Because presumably, if there was a creation, let's try to talk in your kind of language. If there was a creation, then presumably the something that we now experience was preceded by the absence of something. And I presume that we can call the absence of something nothing. So presumably at the creation, somehow or other, absolutely nothing changed into something. Is that what
By
happened?
principles of indolence and
No.
ignorance and...
No, those come later.
Oh, I see. I need to read this, you see,
Yeah.
Peter. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, you catch me out.
But I think...
No, let me speak to the point.
Let me just finish. So presumably you think that if there was absolutely nothing and it turned into absolutely something, that there was an agent involved in causing that. Is that the creation?
I wouldn't quite put it that way.
How would you
I
put
would
it?
say that the universe comes from nothing physical, but it doesn't come from nothing. God is not nothing. In fact, we get the whole thing upside down. We tend to think, partly because of the way we're educated in terms of science, that mass energy and material is the basic stuff of the universe. Of course, now we've come down to nothing being the basic stuff. I would want to say about that is, I don't believe it, but secondly, God is not physical, God is spirit. And the fundamental stuff in the universe is mind and spirit. It's not material. So then, if I could finish, the universe comes from nothing physical, but it doesn't come from nothing. It comes from God who created it. Let there be light, and there was light. And so that is my position.
And that's not a position which you believe conflicts with the science we do know of, the Big Bang?
Not at all. The
cosmology
Big
and so on.
Bang is wonderful because it simply tells us there was a beginning. And science caught up from the Bible, with the Bible in the 1960s. Because science was tied to Aristotle for centuries, believing that there was an eternal universe. Now we believe in a beginning. Whether you mean a beginning of the multiverse or the universe, it doesn't really matter, because the latest mathematical theorems by Guth, the man I just mentioned, Vilenkin and Boyd, say that there is an absolute beginning. So the Bible has said it for centuries.
Now, I think you're willing to grant this idea of an absolute beginning, Peter, but for you...
Cautiously.
Cautiously.
I mean, it could be that time is circular, and that we're just seeing a few billion years and it looks straight. But I'm prepared to accept that there might well have been a beginning.
But your view is that prior, well, if you can speak of being prior to, that there was nothing and the something came from nothing. Obviously, many people will say that sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Well, since we've got something and originally there was nothing, then I think it must be true that nothing turned into something. But what you've got to be very careful about is...
It's not a question of nothing turning into something. But what I would like to say is, in my examination of what people believe nothing is, there's Stephen Hawking, there's Lawrence Krauss, and having read all of their books, I discover that the way they get something from nothing, they're not saying you're doing it, Peter, because I need to investigate your book, but is by redefining nothing, which is a very clever cop-out. Lawrence Krauss, on about page 5 of his book, A Universe from Nothing, says this: because something is physical, nothing must be physical, even if especially if you define it as the absence of something. Well, that's sheer nonsense.
Yeah, I think that's nonsense.
Oh, that's great.
Well, we've got some agreement.
Oh,
which
that's
is
very good.
Let's go to some questions. It's been such fun, actually, being in the middle of this conversation. But we've had a lot of questions texted in, so we really must get to a few of them. I think this is a really interesting one. What new evidence would be sufficient to lead the speakers to adopt the opposite view? So if I perhaps ask that first of you, Peter, is there anything, any kind of evidence that John could bring to bear that would actually make you change your mind and think actually maybe there is a God?
I think that's very interesting. I have asked myself that question previously. You know, is there any evidence that would flip me into the belief camp? And so I simply can't think of any. I think if I tell myself that if I agreed with some evidence, then it showed that I'd simply gone mad.
Right.
So it's a serious question, but I don't think there can be any evidence.
Are you saying your
I mean,
position is unfalsifiable in that sense?
Yes, because even if I was standing, at the foot of a cross and saw the resurrection before my very eyes, I would put it down to hallucination. It's an extension of the David Hume argument.
Do you want to make a comment firstly on the fact that for Peter there's literally nothing that could convince him that
Well,
God
I'm
exists?
very interested in what he said at the end, that he would believe it was a hallucination. And he mentioned to me before that the psychologists would work on what I say, but they'd work on what he said. And one of the evidences for the resurrection of Jesus actually is the work psychologists have done in pointing out that it could not have been a hallucination. He was seen by over 500 people at once, different times of day or night, and all this kind of thing. But there are things that would reverse me.
Okay, tell
And
us what they are.
I joined Peter. If you could give me evidence that the gospel writers, for example, like Luke, were not authentic, if you could give me evidence that there's a really convincing explanation that Jesus did not rise from the dead, if you could show me that all the experiences I've had in life with my family and with other people that I would definitively put down to the activity of God, then I'd be prepared to consider. But those cumulative evidences in my life are so large that I don't think it's likely to happen. But I have to be open to that. Why? Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, because I come from a very religious country, I was accused, and I've been accused tonight of the same thing, of course you believe that stuff, you're Irish. It's the old Freudian explanation. So what have I done? I spent my entire life opening up my Christian commitment to its opposite. It's exactly what I'm doing tonight. And I spent my life doing it. A lot of it in Russia, incidentally, where you meet really hard atheism. And doing that, constantly questioning my own position, has confirmed my position. Now, Peter, do you constantly question your own position? Or do you see no reason to do that?
I see no reason to
Yes,
do
well, I
that.
see great reason to do it, because I don't want to be fooled.
But I see in you an example of the power of cultural conditioning that takes place during childhood.
Well, Peter, I could argue the same. You see, the Freudian argument that says the religion is wish fulfillment, it works brilliantly if there is no God. But you see, I would want to argue that if there is a God, Peter's atheism can equally well be explained as wish fulfillment, the desire never to have to encounter God. The Freudian argument doesn't deal with the basic question, is there a God or not? So I simply think that...
But see, I want to understand the workings of the world on this side of the grave.
So do I.
You seem to want to understand them on the other side.
But why not of both, Peter? It's a bigger universe than just this side of the grave.
Because there isn't anything on the other side.
But that's just an assertion.
No, it's the lack of evidence.
Well,
Let's go to another question. This is a very interesting one. I'm a scientist and long-standing atheist. Taking the challenge as a scientist to follow the evidence where it leads over many years, I have become convinced that there is good evidence to point towards an all-powerful, transcendent, timeless creator. But I cannot square this with how I feel. My instincts, my emotions say it cannot be. It's impossible. Do either of you think it's possible to resolve such a dissonance? How, from each perspective, would you proceed?
Oh my God!
Feel pulled in both directions.
this is absolutely intriguing to me. Why? This morning, I had a letter from a very highly educated a person with a doctorate doing very advanced research who asked me exactly the same question. Exactly the same question. Come from atheism, Dawkins-type atheism, and now feels terribly pulled and wondering, this feels so strange, how can I resolve it? My attitude to that is take time. Talk to other people, other Christians, your friends. Find out what makes them tick. And read as much as you can, full of questions, something like the Gospel of John and so on and so forth. And I believe eventually one can resolve these questions. But it's clear that many people feel like this. And I think it's wonderful if you get that far. And in one sense, they can be resolved. But with many of these things, what the problem we have, especially in our contemporary culture, is the matter of commitment. You see, skepticism is a wonderful thing. The Greek word means to check out from a distance. And some of you will be checking out partners at a distance. But you know as well as I do, in order to have a meaningful relationship, you have to give up your distance. If you want to get to know me, sooner or later, you'll have to give up your distance and I'll have to give up my distance. But if we're sensible, we'll not do it without evidence. And so it's a question of that greatest commitment of all, as I believe it is, which is to Christ. Making that step of commitment is for some people difficult, but it's in the end the only way to test if the thing works.
Do you have any advice for this long-standing atheist who says he's feeling suddenly
Yes,
born?
it's like John's, but has a slightly different thrust.
I thought it might.
It is to hang on to his commitment, but it's to hang on to his commitment to rationality.
Oh, I would want him to hang on to his commitment to rationality, of course, too.
You can't be rational and a Christian.
Right. Any response, John? The gloves are off.
Yes, Peter, yes, I have a response. What do you say to a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who's a Christian?
Grow up.
Well, between 1900 and 2000, 65% of Nobel Prize winners were Christian.
Yeah.
Can you understand, Peter, how saying that might come across as incredibly arrogant?
No.
No. Let's go to another question. Maybe you'll start this one off, John. Why would God create atheists?
I feel quite strongly about this, that the wonderful thing about the way in which we're made as human beings is God loves us enough to give us real responsibility so that our decisions and our moral choices are full of meaning. If you say God creates Christians or atheists, you end up with a kind of robotic situation where we're simply puppets on a string, and I don't think that accords in any way with the God who reveals himself in Christ.
Peter?
I think talk of gods creates atheists.
Talking about God creates atheists. As in, once people start to look into it, they become atheists?
Yeah, well, so they should.
Right.
And when they see that the evil that belief in God brings into the world.
Well, that opens up another interesting question. Here's one who asks, do you agree that science gives facts and religion gives values? What do you say to that, Peter?
Well, I don't know what values are, frankly. They are, I think we're talking about moral values.
I assume that's what...
Of whether science can illuminate morality and questions of moral behaviour and so on. And I think it can, because we behave in ways that are governed by the infrastructure that has emerged through evolution. I mean, it's really, we who've been on this earth for, say, 4 billion years or so, have evolved into us, and we found ways of behaving, and we call that our current moral precepts.
Right. But would
evolution.
you grant the question of the fact that religion could be a factor that helps people to develop those moral values, even if you think it's ultimately got a scientific explanation?
It might be thinking backwards. I imagine that I suspect that quite a lot of what Jesus said, or as purports to have been said, were reverse engineered to make him sound like a jolly nice chap. And he probably was quite a jolly nice chap, if in fact he ever existed. So I think the Bible is a kind of collection of, it's a handbook on getting through life, more.
The same question, I suppose, then, John. This morality, firstly, I suppose, responding to Peter, can it simply be accounted for by a sort of evolutionary cooperation produces?
I don't think so. I think you can base virtually any kind of morality on theories of evolution. If you take the nature red and tooth and claw view and survival of the fittest, you'll end up in Auschwitz.
But I did go beyond that. I said it was larded with the milk of human kindness.
Yes, well, I was just about to say Darwin favoured ants, and if you watch ants, you can get a good argument for altruism and cooperation. You can build any kind of morality on animal behaviour you want. My view is that you cannot get morality from science. Science can comment on it. Science can tell you whether a fetus suffers pain, for example, but it cannot decide the morality of what you do with that fetus.
No, but it can understand. It can understand. And I'm not saying that it can make predictions or anything
Okay.
like that. But I think it can understand the roots of morality.
Well, I'm
That's
not
very
sure that
important.
it can.
I think it's much better to understand the roots of morality through scientific investigation, which includes anthropology, ethology, and so on, than it is simply to adhere to a collection of folk stories as written in various
Well, all
religious
of this is wild speculation. But if I come back to the question of morality and science, Einstein made the point once: you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, points out that the laws of nature don't come along with rules on what we ought to do
But
with them.
evolution does, and ethology does, psychology does, philosophy does. And all of these are...
But saying evolution does is no different from saying God does. It's just putting a label on a non-explanation. But let me come to this, Peter. You slipped in one or two things which troubled me. And one of them was, if Jesus ever existed. Now, you're interested in science and evidence. I do not know, and I've read most of them, an ancient historian in the world who would question not only the existence of Jesus, but the basic facts of his life and so on. People who study these things, and it worries me when a person like you says, if he ever existed.
Well, you should read
because the
more.
evidence is there that he did
You
exist.
should read more widely than you clearly have done. I mean, there's plenty of scholars who've questioned the historical
Yes,
existence.
and if I might say so, Richard Dawkins quoted one of them. Dawkins does believe that Jesus exists, but he says a good case can be made out that Jesus never existed. And he mentions Professor Wells of London. He didn't tell anybody that this is a professor of German, not an ancient historian. So I'm afraid I have read both atheist ancient historians, Christians, agnostics, all the rest. They are agreed basically on this. So it seems to me that if you're interested on making observations and notes and science in that general sense, then quoted one of them. Dawkins does believe that Jesus exists, but he says a good case can be made out that Jesus never existed. And he mentions Professor Wells of London. He didn't tell anybody that this is a professor of German, not an ancient historian. So I'm afraid I have read both atheist ancient historians, Christians, agnostics, all the rest. They are agreed basically on this. So it seems to me that if you're interested on making observations and notes and science in that general sense, then Jesus' existence is scientifically established. It's rationally established by historical science.
I don't know what percentage I put on that. Maybe 80% true, but I don't think 100%.
Let's talk about a question that relates to this. Someone asked, why does John specifically believe in the Christian God? What about other religions? And another person asked a similar question, how is one to decide between the thousands of faith on offer without the use of a reliable method such as science? So why your God and not another one, John, and how do you come to that conclusion in the first place?
This is quite a sensitive question, but the only way I can approach it is by Peter's method of rational inquiry. And you see, at one level, let's take the three monotheistic religions. But before I say anything, this is important. You've heard me clearly say that I believe you, whatever you believe, are made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. Secondly, you've heard me say that I believe that there's a common element in morality. So when you raise with me the questions of other religions, please understand, I'm not criticizing your morality. That is very important. Nor am I criticizing your value. I'm being asked a rational question. On what basis do you choose? So I'll tell you. Here is one level. The three great monotheistic religions, their attitude to the resurrection, forgive me, Peter, if I raise it again, is, forgive the pun, it wasn't intended. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Those three things cannot be simultaneously historically correct. So we have to do investigations in exactly the same way as we investigate any event in history. We can't repeat it to see what happens, but we can make an inference to the best
Getting
explanation.
spanked.
And all I can say in short answer is, I've done that investigation many times and come to the conclusion that the Christian explanation is true. But there's a second explanation, and it's this. I often ask myself, traveling around the world as I've done, ask people of different religions what they mean by a religion. And they usually come up with something like Southampton University, in the following sense. You have an entrance exam into the university and you get in. And then you're on the way or the path, and you're being taught by delightful professors. And then you face the final judgment, which is called finals. Do you recognize that? Okay. Now, on the way, on your path, the professors, however kind they are, cannot guarantee that you're going to get through at the end. Why? Because the basic principle of a university course is merit. Now, many of my friends, when I ask them about religion, including Christianity, they say that's it. There's a ceremony at the beginning, perhaps performed on a child or an adult, then you're on the way, or the Eightfold Path, or whatever it is, the Tao, the teaching, and then you're faced with a final assessment. But the teachers, the gurus, and all the rest of them, the priests, cannot guarantee your acceptance at that final judgment.
I think I can provide...
Now, just a bit...
Oh, I thought you finished.
No, I think John hasn't quite hit the punchline yet.
I haven't hit the punchline. Christianity, if that's what religion is, Christianity is not a religion, for a very simple reason. In Christianity, the acceptance comes at the beginning, not the end. Now, I mentioned that briefly on the way through tonight, and this is the spectacular difference, that as I sit here, I've not reached the final judgment, but I know that I'm accepted. Why? Because I'm very good? No. Because of what Christ has done. And the absolute essence of what it is to be a Christian is that I have trusted him, that what he did on the cross, now this may seem all mystique to you, but let me say what it is, that what he did there means that I can be accepted at the beginning of the journey. That makes a spectacular difference. In fact, you wouldn't if it was a question of marriage. Imagine I propose to a girl and say, look, here's a cookbook. There are rules in it. You keep them pretty well for the next 40 years and then I'll accept you. Well, she'd throw the book in my face. But that's what many of us think of God. No wonder people give up on religion, in my view.
You're finished.
Because it becomes a slavish trying to merit acceptance when Christ is prepared to give his salvation as a free gift. So I'm not doing this evening, for example, to gain brownie points with God. I'm doing it because God has accepted me, and that is the wonder of Christianity to me.
Well, if I can help John with a more succinct answer to why he is a Christian, it's simply that he was brought up in Ireland.
But Peter, that's absurd. That's saying that because you give a genetic origin for me, that explains everything I do.
It's a cultural condition.
No, but the point is, Peter,
And I've met many Northern Irish atheists as well.
there are very many.
There are always exceptions.
But Peter, I have experienced again and again people changing their worldview, which shows it's not culturally dependent. That was
No,
one
it
of the
doesn't
most
show that at all.
important questions for me
It
in life.
shows that you are particularly contaminated by your upbringing.
Well, it's very nice of you to say so.
It's been an interesting evening. We are sort of needing to draw things to a
Yes, that's
close. Are there any final things we'd like to say that we want to sort of round off the evening with before we go our separate ways? Do you want to start, Peter?
Well, science is the way, the truth, and the light. We should be proud, as I said right at the beginning, that somehow or other, through collaborative enterprise and open-mindedness and mathematization and observation, we are delving into the workings of the world, into, if you like, the fabric of reality, and answering all the great questions of being. We should be proud that we apes who have dropped from the trees have gone so far intellectually. And although I acknowledge that religious belief was a component of that journey, we are breaking out of that chrysalis and taking over the heath.
John, final thoughts.
Science is wonderful. But the God who gives us a world in which science can be done is even more wonderful. And I'm very thankful that it's not an abstract set of intellectual disciplines, but a person who said, I am the way and the truth and the life.
Can we have a round of applause for both our guests?
Cole, he's my miracle child. So how does your miracle child get cancer? How does that happen?
There was a mass, basically a tennis ball-sized tumor at the base of his brain. We were then rushed over to our local children's hospital, and
Good evening and welcome. It's great to see so many of you joining us here at Southampton University, but also welcome to all who are joining us via the live stream. My name's Bethany Squires. I'm a member of the Christian Union here, and I'm also a third-year Natural Sciences student.
Good God.
We are really excited to be joined by Peter Atkins. He is an emeritus professor in chemistry from the University of Oxford. I know I'm not the only one in this room who has suffered at the hands
Angst, worries about the nature of the world, projections of human ideas where they are not supported by any evidence. Science.
Hello, I'm Justin Briley. Welcome along to the second in a series of 4 programmes in which we ask, have we misread the Bible? My guests today are Steve Chalke and Andrew Wilson. Steve Chalke is the founder of the Oasis Trust and pastor of Oasis Church in Waterloo. He's a well-known author and a leading and sometimes outspoken voice in the Oasis Church. In recent decades, Steve has sparked intense debates on issues like the nature of the cross and homosexuality. Most recently, he's published an article in the March edition of Christianity magazine calling for a fresh approach to biblical interpretation. Andrew Wilson is a speaker, author and theologian with the New Frontiers Network. Andrew takes a more conservative and, in his view, more biblical approach to issues like the atonement and sexuality. His own article on biblical interpretation can be found in the April edition of Christianity magazine. Well, today they're joining me to talk about whether we need to change the way we read the Bible. And over the course of these 4 programmes, we're discussing their different views on biblical inerrancy, infallibility, authority, the atonement and sexuality. Now, for the articles by Steve and Andrew, you may want to go and read them or indeed watch more of these conversations. You can find all the links at christianitymagazine.co.uk/Bible debate. In this second programme, we're tackling the subject of how we interpret tough passages in the Old Testament. The warfare, the seemingly harsh moral codes and punishments in certain parts of Scripture, the bits that we don't normally post up as inspirational Bible verses on our Facebook feed. So how do we treat these passages? How do we treat the whole Bible in turn? Steve and Andrew, welcome again to the programme. Great to have you with me. So I'm going to start off again this week with a real-world example, and this is the one you use actually at the start of your magazine article for Christianity, Steve. In May 2012, Michael Gove announced plans for the distribution of the King James Version of the Bible into every school in England to mark the 400th anniversary of its publication. Now, arch-atheist Richard Dawkins was an unlikely voice giving his backing to this project, but his motives became clear when he wrote in The Observer that people who do not know the Bible well have been gulled into thinking it's a good guide to morality. The surest way to disabuse yourself of this pernicious falsehood is to read the Bible itself. So Dawkins may well have his opinions, but how do Christians make sense of the Bible and its morality? That's what we're asking today. You quoted that particular example in your article, Steve. What do you make of Dawkins' claim that if people read the Bible, they'll be disabused of the idea that it's any sort of a guide to morality?
I've met Richard Dawkins and debated with him and talked with him, and I wouldn't really like to debate him on his subject. He's absolutely brilliant. But on the subject of literary criticism, on the subject of hermeneutics, by which I'm not talking about the Bible necessarily, just how you deal with ancient documents and understand ancient documents, he really needs to go back to school. So his ideas are very juvenile, and that's what I say. Or, worse than that, he actually does understand literary criticism, and he's choosing to ignore all that to make a kind of cheap point. Okay. The point I raised, though, in my article is that over the years I've come to see, sadly, that so many Christians also have exactly the same juvenile understanding of the Bible, and then go losing their faith, end up in all sorts of troubles. When in actual fact, if we can give people and develop ourselves a more robust and a deeper understanding of what the Bible actually is, we attribute to it the authority that it deserves. So that's really where I'm coming from on this whole thing.
I'm sure in your dealings online and so on, you must have come across the many sort of atheist sites and commentaries and so on that take issue with
There's
the Old
atheist
Testament.
websites.
Apparently, yeah.
And they've read this.
They say. But it's a frequent objection thrown at the Bible. How can you worship a God who approves massacres and this and that and the other? So what's your take on Dawkins' view?
Very similar to Steve, really. I think a hermeneutical blindness or naivety or deliberate, I don't know, actually. I've not really been aware. Obviously, the first time we ever met was because I'd written a response to Richard Dawkins and picked up on some of these issues as we were talking about it. I suspect Steve and I would differ on what we do with some of the texts and whether or not they actually historically happened or not. I think that's probably, I would say yes, and Steve might say no on some of those. But in terms of how we are to handle them through the lens of Christ, and how we are to see, as we talked about last week, unfolding revelation, coming to a climax in Jesus and what he does in Israel's story and how people need to live today, and inclusivity of the Gentiles and all the nations as well. I suspect Steve and I will be on exactly the same page on that one. And I agree, actually. I've also met Christians who, because they read the whole Bible and aren't aware of that unfolding story, analogy I've often used is that Lord of the Rings, where you imagine Gandalf gives an instruction to the hobbits at the start of book 1 and says, "Meet me by the prancing pony in Bree." The best way of honouring what he said is not if Frodo and Sam are climbing up Mount Doom in book 3, and then Sam suddenly grabs him and goes, "Mr. Frodo, we got to go back to the prancing pony because Gandalf said so." You think, no, that's not how you're supposed to read commands that occur in one part of the story. Okay. And on this, I'm sure we'd entirely agree. So you'd honour what he said then by seeing where it fitted into Israel's unfolding story, and see that the instruction you're given now is different. So
let me give an example then from Scripture. One that potentially you may take a different view on how we're to interpret this, apply it today, and so on. One that frequently is thrown in as an objection is there's a story in Numbers 15 in which a man is brought before Moses. He has to decide on what to do with him. He's been picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and Moses believes he hears from God that this man should be put to death. And so obviously the objection is, what a ridiculous morality that a man should be put to death for picking up sticks on the supposed holy day. How do you treat that kind of a story in the Old Testament?
Well, the first thing is, I think it's saying I believe it happened.
Okay. So you don't particularly doubt the historicity on that one?
Because I think it's now.
What up, Stream Hub World? That's a cool emoji. Or emote.
Is this a poem? Is this a dream? Is this a piece of historical narrative? Is this a piece of legal code? Is this a parable? And you've got to start with there. Now, actually, there's loads of scholars. So I have a very high view of the Bible and a very supremely high view of Jesus. So it's hard for me to talk about the Old Testament without talking about Jesus in the end. Okay. But having a bash at it.
Hello and welcome to a classic playback edition of Unbelievable. The conversation you're about to watch between Rob Bell and Adrian Warnock was first recorded in 2011, shortly after the release of Rob Bell's book Love Wins. The show was one of the most popular in the history of the podcast, and the video was widely watched at the time, but has never actually been released on our own Unbelievable YouTube channel until now. So enjoy it, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more conversations that matter every week. And why not subscribe to our newsletter as well? That way you'll never miss anything, and you'll get my free ebook featuring conversations with people like Jordan Peterson, Richard Dawkins, and indeed Rob Bell. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.
You're an author, and probably, though, the latest release, Love Wins, has sort of put all the other books somewhat in the shade in terms of the reaction it's had. Tell me, did you anticipate the response that this book would have, has had?
Which response?
Well,
Because people have been extraordinarily kind and supportive and grateful. And I love the process, the hunt, the discovery, the exploration, the thing that God is doing in me, the thing that's happening in my own soul and spirit, my own walk with Christ, and out of that, the sense of I need to make this, whether it's a film, a book, a sermon, or something. So to me, that every morning sitting at my desk and it's quiet and I'm working away at the next thing, is sort of how my life is oriented. So if the thing that got created could help somebody, if it could help them find Christ and find healing and salvation and wholeness and hope and joy, that's like, that's too good to be true. So I'll start there.
Okay. Obviously, though, that's not the only kind of reaction.
Apparently, from what I'm told, there's other reactions as well.
Have you been looking at the reactions? I mean, do you go online on the blogs, on the reviews?
No.
You don't look at it?
I don't Google my name.
And is that just purely because it's too much? There's be too much to look at, or just
right? If you started, where would you stop? And I am passionate about people who haven't heard this gospel good news hearing it. So I do my best to articulate it. This book is part of an ongoing discussion. It's not the last word. I never thought it was, and I assume nobody else thinks it's the last word.
Well,
so I'm taking part in this ongoing discussion, and it's okay. The other opinions and perspectives are beautiful. Good.
Well,
Wonderful.
we've got another opinion and perspective represented here in the studio today. My other guest is Adrian Warnock.
Hi, Adrian.
Adrian, thanks for joining me today as well. Adrian, you are sort of in the UK scene quite well known as a church blogger. You often, give your opinion on various things going on, movements in the church, etc. What did you make of the response to Rob's book in the blogosphere?
Well, look, let's just start by saying, Rob, it's very clear to me that you've written out of deep conviction shaped by your experience, and you've always been someone who's tried to reach out to particularly people who've been hurt by church expressions and who, are in danger of running away from church altogether. And I have to say, I am sorry that there's been some people who've been really quite hurtful online. I'm glad that perhaps you haven't read some of that stuff, but you must have been aware of it, at least peripherally. Some people talk about the pajama Hadeen, and I don't think.
Wait, what's that?
Oh, the idea that bloggers are, sitting in their pajamas with nothing better to do than be like, part of the.
And what's the second word?
Hajeen, as in sort of warfare.
Pajama.
Hajeen. Yeah, that's quite a.
That's a new one on. That's a new one on
I'm
me
taking
as
that
well.
phrase. I wish I had pen and paper.
Yeah, that's good.
We'll pass you one.
And I just want to say right at the outset of this, I've no intention to be hateful to you or to anyone.
Okay.
And I think but I do feel that every Christian has a duty to contend for the faith once for all delivered to us. And certainly in the videos online, in the publicity around the book, and in actually the book itself, you seem to have claimed that many Christians, have had an unhelpful understanding of the gospel, and there's the implication that actually they've been wrong, essentially. And I do feel that the faith has been delivered to us, and we must contend for that. And I guess I'd be much more traditional than you. At one point in the book, you talk about your grandmother's faith, or a picture in your grandmother's house, and the clear implication is that you've sort of moved away a bit from your grandmother's faith. And for me, I want to be part of my grandparents' faith and the forefathers' faith, and to preach a Christianity that those who've gone before would still recognise.
Rob, this kind of leads us into one of the questions that came in was David, a pastor in Kent, who says, "What have been your key influences when it came to writing the book?"
My grandmother.
Well, what made you start to think this way in particular? You know, in terms of the themes of heaven and hell that you bring out in the book. I mean, was this the way you thought when you started Mars Hill 10 years ago? Would you say you changed significantly theologically in that time?
Well, I'm like a lot of people. You study and you grow and you learn and you see things one way and then you begin to see them in a different way. It always came out of, like as a pastor giving sermons, you study the text, you study other texts.
Good golly. Good golly.
Dig around in the Greek, you dig around in the Hebrew, you start realizing, wait, some of these phrases come up again and again and again. What's that about? Where is that? Has anybody else in the tradition picked up on this? What are the implications of this? Paul says this here. Jesus uses this image. Does he use any other image like this? Wait, there's this commentary on this parable. Whoa, I haven't heard that before. I wonder what else is there.
So your thinking has definitely obviously developed in those 10 years, just coming to the text again and again. I mean, what's interesting to me is someone put me onto an archive of the very first sort of MP3s that came from Mars Hill way back in the day. It does exist somewhere on Google. Yeah, you can get it. And I just listened to the first sermon you gave, and I was like, Rob, it's still Rob, but he does sound quite different. He's using some terms that you wouldn't hear him talking about in quite the same way today. So I just got the sense that you have kind of, at least in the way you present it, changed somewhat in your sort of the way you think theologically a bit, maybe.
Have you?
Oh yes, absolutely. We all go on a journey, don't we, theologically? Yeah. But I mean, let's get down though to some of the key questions we've got today. So obviously the big one we need to start with, I think, is universalism. Because you've made statements, Rob, to say, I'm not a universalist. But on a kind of straightforward reading of the book, that's obviously what many people are coming away with, that you are a universalist. You do believe all people will ultimately be saved. Now, I know that you've said that you don't believe in a kind of big hand of God sweeping everyone into heaven, whether they like it or not that kind of universalism. But is it fair to say you do believe in a universalism in the sense of that everyone will ultimately freely choose to be won over by the love of God?
I don't know. Do you?
Well,
do you?
It's interesting because I don't think Jesus did. Because Jesus talks about hell, he talks about a fire that won't go out, torment that's unending. And, you know, certainly in your book you say that no one can resist God's pursuit forever because God's love will eventually melt.
That is
the
a
hardest
perspective
hearts.
of, I mean, there has been that strand within the Christian tradition. There are people who have said, oh yeah, given enough time, God will win everybody over. What a beautiful thought, but I don't know. And to sort of stake a claim that that's going to happen, how would anybody know that?
I mean, obviously, you outline different positions in the book.
Yes.
So you say some people think this,
yes,
some people think this.
Yes.
And here's now, I suppose what struck me when I read it was that it is that position of everyone ultimately being one, which is the one you kind of major on, that you give the most time to in your chapter, Does God Get What God Wants? And so just to quote from a couple of bits there, on one page you say, will all the ends of the earth come as God has decided, or only some? Will all feast, as is promised in Psalm 22, or only a few? Will everybody be given a new heart, or only a limited number of people? Will God, in the end, settle saying, well, I tried, I gave it my best shot, and sometimes you just have to be okay with failure? Now, when I read that, although they're phrased as questions, I obviously think, well, Rob obviously doesn't believe that God fails and God settles back and says, oh, well, I tried, but it didn't work. It comes out that you're not agnostic on this, Rob. It comes out that you do believe everyone will ultimately be saved. Of course, you acknowledge that's just one in a variety of options, but it sounds like that's the one you prefer, or you're most convinced by.
Do you long for that to happen?
Oh, yes. Well, Adrian.
Well, look.
Do you long for it to happen?
I'm not a Christian who believes that only a few will be saved, that's for sure. I think there are, and that's one of the positions that I think you kind of react against in the book, you know, this idea that billions and billions of people are going to end up in hell. And that the minority will be saved. But I think there's a different question about whether you believe the majority will be saved or all. And so I don't feel that my reading of the scripture would allow me to say that hell will be empty. I don't see that.
And my observation from what I see in our world right now is I see lots of people choosing hell. And I actually think it's incredibly important that we hold on to hell. And if you're asking me, I see lots of people resisting God's love right now, resisting Christ right now, and my assumption is they are free to resist when they die. And I talk about the momentum theory. You tell a lie, you have to tell another lie. That our choices have very real consequences, and we can build a head of steam in a particular direction, and we can build a head of steam in a direction away from God. So I see lots of people who it looks clearly like they're choosing hell now. Their consequences are spreading hell to others, and I would kind of assume that they'll continue on in that direction.
Well, I guess this is the thing that many people are feeling a bit frustrated by, Rob, is that they feel like they've read you making statements in this book, and then when you've talked about the book afterwards, they feel you've backpedaled or at least soft-pedaled what you've actually said about it. Because I have to confess, when I read the book, without any knowledge that you'd be coming into my studio, I thought, wow, Rob Bell's come out as a universalist. Now, why did I come away with that impression if you are really just setting out a range of options and you're not really saying you are firmly in any camp? I mean, is that being a bit disingenuous, Rob?
I think in the book I talk about hell now and hell later. I see people choosing hell now. I live with the assumption that people will choose hell when they die. There's this picture in Revelation of this new creation, new heaven and new earth. Earth and heaven become one, this beautiful city, and there are people outside of it.
There it is.
And in this picture,
There it is. There it was, and there it goes again.
I know I'm asking.
What is the... Do you know?
No, I don't.
Do you know?
Well, I think Jesus knew, and Jesus said that there'll be those that he would send away. And here's one of the things that really concerns me, you know, as a teacher, and I'm sure it concerns you as well, that, you know, when James it says that we who teach will be judged more severely than the rest, and Jesus does seem to say that there will even be some who, you know, who've preached, who've healed, even talks about miracles in his name, and he'll say, look, away from me, I never knew you. And he says that repeatedly about this idea of an eternal punishment where the fire doesn't stop, and I think it really matters whether that's real or not. And if you
Sunday, buddy. God bless you.
saying that you don't really believe the simple words of Jesus, then I've got big concerns about you, Rob, as a person, and what those consequences for you might be. I've got concerns for people listening, though, as well. See, my worry is this, that someone could read your book or listen to you and decide, well, you know what, it doesn't matter. Because people think that to a certain extent even now. When they hear the sort of more traditional gospel messages that say, hey, you know, it really matters what you do in this life. You've got to respond to Jesus. You can sin, but then once you've repented, you'll be forgiven. A lot of people hear that and go, I know, I'll repent on my deathbed. And I think that's very dangerous because you never know whether you're going to have a deathbed in that sense. But what about someone who listens to you and says, well, it's fine, I'll just wait till I'm in hell, then I'll take the ticket out of here. Thank you very much. You know, the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus said there's a chasm that no one can cross.
If I can back this up just with another question, I've got so many questions, Rob, I feel like I owe my listeners asking a few of them. Peter, on that very subject that's just been raised there, asks, you know, what's to stop me choosing to ignore Jesus and doing whatever I want, knowing that not only will lovers of Christ ultimately win, but rejection of haters too in unworthy after. So the question is this a death knell for evangelism, and B, people taking things seriously enough if they come to this view that I'm always going to have a chance to turn around?
I begin with the urgent, immediate call of Jesus to repent right now. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing, I don't know how many interviews in a row, is because to me it all begins
Happy Sunday, buddy. God bless
Jesus
you.
saying
Stay prayed.
repent now. Here.